Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Let's begin today's session of the comprehensive news analysis with the first article that is on a topic that has been heatedly debated over the past couple of months. That is India's neutral stand in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine crisis. The author here is trying to discuss why is it that India has taken a neutral stand in the ongoing conflict in the view of yesterday's happenings. That is, when the UN was voting to remove Russia from the Human Rights Council, India decided to abstain from that vote as well. That is in a series of votes that India has abstained from in the UN when they are concerned with the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Now, the author here says that India has maintained a neutral approach ever since our independence. So, India, by adopting a neutral approach in the ongoing crisis, has not changed its foreign policy. In fact, since the time of Nehru, in most of the international conflicts, especially when one of our partners or one of our allies is involved, we prefer to take a neutral stand. In fact, India's condemnation of the civilian killings in Bucha in Ukraine is actually a part of the same strategy. Although India did not name anyone, but India did call for an independent probe on this issue. Calling for an independent probe in the civilian killings should in fact be seen as a step ahead in India's policy. That is, India has at least said that although we don't know which side is guilty of that, but we want an independent inquiry to be taken up in that matter. But as per the author, this has been a long-term foreign policy of India. Now, the interesting part is that while the Western nations, mainly the US, are focusing on India only and are trying to force India to take a stand against Russia, what they are ignoring is that there are many other nations, some of them in fact key allies of the US, that have done the same. Let me give you some examples. South Africa, for example, also abstained from voting in the UN that sought to condemn Russia. Now, you might say South Africa is not such a close ally of the US, but let's take two more examples, UAE and Israel, two countries which are very close allies of the US in different matters. UAE abstained from the vote in the UNSC, while Israel, which is USA's closest ally, at least in Western Asia, did condemn the Russian attack, but did not join the demand for sanctions against Russia. Not just this, Israel did not even commit to sending any defense systems to Ukraine. And this is when Israel boasts of some of the most advanced weapon systems in the entire world. Thus, the question is, why is it that the US is not trying to force its allies and is only forcing India to take a stand against Russia? There are a lot of different statements coming in from the American side with respect to the Indian stand. For example, a few days back, the American president said that India's position with respect to Russia is somewhat shaky. In fact, the lowest point in this discussion came when recently the Deputy National Security Advisor of US, Dalip Singh, was in India, and he said that India will face the consequences if it conducts trade with Russia, circumventing the American sanctions. Now, his little speech was not appreciated by anyone in India because India is a proud sovereign nation. We have a history of taking our decisions ourselves without coming under any pressure from any of the world powers, and we want this to remain the same way. Thus, a foreign dignitary coming to India and saying that India will face the consequences for its decisions did not really go well with the Indian higher authorities, especially when just next week we'll have the 2+2 dialogue between India and the US. Maybe that dialogue will give us a space to hatch some of these differences and understand each other's point of views. The author here says that the reason why America is so hell-bent on bringing India to its side can be because of three reasons. They are political, economic and strategic reasons. Let's start with the political reasons. Now, ever since the war started, American president and the American leadership has been trying to project that the war of Russia is not really against Ukraine. It is actually Russia's war on America, which is being fought through Ukraine. So it is being painted as an assault on the US. Now, for this narrative to be successful, it is important that the world's largest democracy, that is India, should also take the side of US. Only then the US would be able to convince its local population and other people around the world that this is actually Russia's war against the modern democracies. Second reason can be economic. There are only 3 Asian nations right now which have backed the US sanctions. That is Japan, South Korea, Singapore, all 3 which are key allies of the US. Now, apart from these 3, the US obviously does not expect China to join these sanctions. So the next major economy of Asia is India. And that is why India's continued trade with Russia is actually making these sanctions much less powerful as compared to what they should have been. And that is why America wants India to stop whatever little trade it has with Russia. Also, do understand, if you look at India-Russia bilateral trade, usually over the years it has remained below $10 billion. So even if India does stop its trade with Russia, it would not really dent the Russian economy so much because this is not such a large number. In fact, most of this number is made up of the defense purchases, which we are anyways not going to reject because of the American sanctions. So this would not really convert into any big change on the ground. And the third possible reason given by the author is strategic. Now, strategically, India has been successful in balancing our relationship with the US and Russia. In the past 3 decades or so, since the 1991 reforms, India's relationship with US and the Western nations collectively has improved considerably, while at the same time we have ensured that we are not very far away from Russia. But now is a time that USA wants to check this power and they want India to take a permanent side, which is not an easy decision for India to make. Now, all these reasons are from the American point of view. But let's understand the same issues from the Indian point of view. Now, in India, we have to look at what is happening in our neighborhood. The American withdrawal from Afghanistan, leaving the country entirely in a haphazard manner, also the Russian invasion of Ukraine, means that our neighborhood right now is in the middle of instability of many kinds. And while we can choose our friends, we cannot really choose our neighbors. And that is why India cannot afford to have bad relationships with one more country in our neighborhood after our sour relationships with China and Pakistan. Thus, India, at least for now, is viewing this confrontation as something that is happening in Europe, which does not really concern India directly. And that is why India has chosen to remain neutral in this matter so far. It should not come as any surprise to anyone that at the end of the day, any country's foreign policy is based on its own national interest. And for India, our national interest says that Russia should remain a robust nation, not just for defense and energy needs, but also for geopolitical reasons. And that is why we cannot afford to see Russia bending down completely to the demands that is made by the West. And if you look at it deeper, this entire crisis that emerged, the Western nations, the NATO, US, all of them have a major role to play in where we have ended up right now. It was the Western nations that promised NATO membership to Ukraine in 2008, which is what triggered Russia's response, first the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and now this. And in all of this, we have seen no robust help from NATO to Ukraine. They have refused to give Ukraine membership, they have refused to intervene with their soldiers on the ground, and Ukraine has been left to bear the brunt of the Russian invasion. So the mistake that America, NATO and other Western countries did, for that India should not have to pay for that by compromising our own national interest. Yes, we are a member of certain groups with the US such as Quad, but it is not really an alliance. And that is why India, like every other country, has the right to take its policies in the manner that we feel our national interest would be achieved the best. Now, there are a lot of interesting views that you need to understand here. The Western nations, America, Europe, are all preaching India that we are the land of Mahatma Gandhi, we should take the side of non-violence, and all that is correct. But the fact is that if you look at the decisions of the Western nations, this is no less hypocrisy. Most of the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia by America or the European nations are done keeping in mind that their own oil and gas and their own economy does not get affected by that. Most of the European countries, as I speak to you today, are still importing gas from Russia. Only a few handful of them have stopped these transactions. So when Europe cannot stop its trade with Russia, how can you expect India to do that when we did not even have any role to play in this crisis to begin with? From the side of India, the Indian government had offered this official explanation note on 25th of Feb, where India for the first time decided to abstain from resolution against Russia in the UN Security Council. India said that we are disturbed with the events that are happening in Ukraine. However, we believe that all the member states should honor the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity and international law, and we believe that dialogue is the only way for settling these differences. This largely has remained India's stand since the beginning of the war till today. Also, this should not really come as a big surprise because this is not the first time that India or Russia have had each other's back in the United Nations. If you look at the history, there are multiple instances where India has supported Russia, while Russia has supported India's stand in the UN Security Council. For example, India supported Russia when there was an issue of Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Afghanistan and Cambodia. In 1956, when there was a Hungarian revolution where Russia or USSR intervened in Hungary, then there was Czechoslovakia's Prague Spring in 1968. In all these matters, India took the side of Russia. Russia returned the favor by voting in favor of India against the UNSC resolution calling for a plebiscite in Kashmir. Similarly, in September 1979, when Vietnam and Russia were accused of starting aggression, India again sided with the USSR. In fact, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was accused of endorsing USSR's move as New Delhi again supported Moscow. So what is happening today is not really something that should surprise the Western nations, and India has many reasons for that. Whenever we talk of defense supplies from Russia, although US time and time again says that you can buy weapons from us, but the reality is that Russia remains the only country to offer top of the line weapons to India whenever we require them. Be it the S-400 missile defense system, be it the nuclear powered submarines which they have lent to India more than once, and many other weapons. In fact, over half of India's military weapons still are dependent on Russia for their maintenance and for their technical support. And that is why for India, it is not really possible to ignore Russia and to look towards the Western nations. The next article that we have again is from International Relations. It is focusing on the recently concluded India-Australia Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement, that is ECTA. The discussions on which had begun in June 2020 itself. Now, this is a very welcome step in the sense that the two nations, despite having a common culture, despite having a lot of respect for each other, had only known each other mainly through cricket only and not through economic and trade. However, this particular agreement that has been finalized now covers a lot of economic and commercial relations, including trade in goods, services, technical barriers, etc. The current trade between the two sides in 2021 was about $27.5 billion. The two sides have now put a target of achieving $50 billion in the next 5 years. As per the agreement, Australia has agreed to eliminate tariff on more than 96% of India's imports, including labor-intensive industries. India, on the other hand, has allowed duty-free entry to 85% of Australian goods, export by value, from first day onwards, and within the next 10 years, we will cut down tariffs on another 5% of Australian merchandise. Now, you must understand the circumstances under which such an agreement has been signed. Both India and Australia have been on very bad terms with China, especially in the past couple of years. While Australia has been looking to find an alternate market for supply and for export, which can allow it to circumvent China, India, on the other hand, wants to show the world that it is a new India now and we are open to signing trade agreements. Because internationally, India has an image that India is averse to signing trade agreements. Usually, we are very concerned about protecting our local industries and we don't really want to sign any free trade agreements. That is why we moved out of the RCEP also at the last instance. We have not been part of major trade agreements. But this is a welcome sign that India is ready to be a trade partner with major nations across the world. Now, the talks between India and Australia have initiated earlier as well. However, there have been some issues on which the two sides have not really had common ideas. One of them was the dairy sector. Now, Australia has a lot of dairy products in excess which they want to export. India, on the other hand, wants to protect our dairy farmers and the dairy industry. That is why India, whenever we sign a free trade agreement, does not want tax-free treatment for foreign products in the dairy sector. Australia would want to send their cheese, other dairy products to India without any taxes. India, however, on the other hand, does not want that to happen. This is why the two sides have not been able to arrive at a comprehensive free trade agreement for a long time, because dairy is one of those things on which the two sides don't really agree. However, now both the sides have shown a bigger heart and this issue has been kept aside for the future date. And we have decided that okay, in the future, we will talk about this later. In effect, this is what India wanted, because this trade agreement that has been finalized does not include dairy. So India still has the right to impose taxes on the dairy product that Australia would send to India. This agreement also includes the concept of natural persons, that is, investors, business visitors who visit each other's countries frequently will be given free access to each other's countries. Another area where Australia wants India to focus is education. Now, many people say that Australia is a second US. That is, the education industry and other aspects of Australia are very similar to that of US. That is why, for people who wanted to study in US originally, can also see Australia as a good alternative to that. Australia has some of the most well-known universities across the world, and they would want students from across the world to come and study in Australia, including the Indian students. That's why Australia has agreed to ease visa restrictions also and enable students at various levels of higher education to stay for 18 months to 4 years after their degree has been completed so that they can earn in Australia and pay back for their degree. Now, as you can see, Australia will give duty-free treatment to about 96% of India's products, while India will give duty-free treatment to about 85% of Australia's products. So the question is, what exactly has been excluded in this agreement then? India, as I said earlier, has always had a concern with dairy products coming from Australia because they are of great quality and they can disrupt the local dairy market. So the products, for now at least, that have been excluded include milk and dairy, chickpeas, walnuts, pistachio, wheat, rice, bajra, apples, sugar, gold, silver, etc. All of these have not been included in the free trade agreement, meaning that these commodities will still be taxed. However, they will be taken up for discussion at a later stage by both the nations together. One other interesting point here in this agreement is that it does not have any provisions for investment protection, such as providing foreign investment to most favored nation and protection from expropriation, assurances for their capital, etc. This is one of those provisions that has been missing in this agreement. Now, there is a slight mention of that in Article 14 of this agreement. It says that there is a list of topics on which negotiations will take place in the future, but that also does not include any chapter on investment protection. Now, this is also something that is seen to be India's demand because Australia's similar agreements with Peru, Indonesia, Hong Kong all have a chapter on investment protection. On the other hand, India's latest agreements with the UAE and Mauritius do not have any investment chapter. So this seems to be going the way that India wants it to, and that is why, as per the experts, this agreement signed between the two sides is more in favor of India as compared to Australia. One more short note before we jump on to our next article. There are multiple articles in the international media that say that the American government had a major role to play as a mediator in this agreement, because Australia wanted this agreement to cover many other things including the dairy sector, etc. But it was the American officials that ensured that Australia lets go of some of their demands and finalize this agreement. This is seen as America's attempt to come closer to India, also to kind of try and isolate China, because China right now is not on good terms with India or Australia. This is also seen as an attempt by the US to prove to India that now you can come closer to us and you can leave the hand of Russia. All this has been covered a lot in the international media. Now let's jump on to the next article that is focusing on India's position on Russia and its impact on the United States. This is very similar to the first article that we discussed today about India's neutral stand. This article is in the form of an interview where there are two participants. First person, you might know him, that is Mr. Syed Akbaruddin. He is India's permanent representative to the UN. So in other ways, he is speaking the government's point of view. Then we have Miss Lisa Curtis, who earlier served in the American White House as a senior director at the National Security Council. So she is speaking from the American point of view. Now in this article, Miss Curtis is making a point that India must change its stand, and while America does understand that there are some restrictions on India and India cannot all of a sudden start opposing Russia and stop its defense buying from Russia, but it should take its stand in favor of America if it wants the future to be more secure. Ms. Curtis says that in America, while the government of America does understand that India needs some time to move away from Russia, but the American public at a large is not really happy with India's approach. She says that American public is viewing India with confusion, frustration and lack of appreciation. On the other hand, Mr. Akbaruddin, who is putting forward India's point of view, is saying that you must understand India's position. Yes, India has abstained from voting against Russia in all these resolutions, but India, after the civilian killings, did ask for an independent inquiry into this incident that should be seen as India moving forward in this direction and following the international law. Ms. Curtis says that while over 140 nations across the world have condemned Russia's actions, India, by not taking a similar stand, is isolating itself. India might think that its position is neutral because it is not voting on this matter, either for or against, but in reality, for the rest of the world, neutral position is a position that is in support of Russia. That is why we have seen that every time India has abstained from voting, someone from Russia has officially thanked India for their stand. There is one very interesting idea that is coming out from the comments made by Ms. Curtis. She is saying that while the American government understands that for its defense procurement, India has to be dependent on Russia and it cannot stop its purchase overnight, especially because India is also facing a threat from China. That much the American government understands. But the problem starts when India is now going ahead and buying Russian oil at a discounted price, because that is something that India did not used to do earlier. Now, if you are buying discounted oil from Russia, that means all the sanctions imposed by America and European countries will go to waste. This is where the line must be drawn, and India should not go ahead with the oil purchase. This is the main point that the American government wants to stress with India. As far as the military equipment part is concerned, we can still make do with that. Now, the answer to this is given by Mr. Akbaruddin. He is saying that the word sanctions have a legal backing in US and Europe. They have imposed sanctions, especially keeping in mind that it does not adversely affect their economy. For example, there are no measures against importing uranium by the US. Oil is still being imported by Europe. Gas is still being imported by Europe from Russia. Then how is it that India is being asked to stop its import? Europe also can import oil from other countries. They can import gas from other countries. But Europe does not want to do that because they would have to pay a higher price for that. So if Europe can buy cheaper oil and gas from Russia, why is it that India cannot do the same? If the amount of oil that India is importing from Russian Federation will help reduce the economic burden on our own people, why should India not go ahead with that? And anyways, it is America that has imposed sanctions on nations such as Venezuela, Iran, etc., because of which globally there is a shortage of oil supply. If sanctions on Venezuela, Iran, etc. are eased out, automatically there will be much more oil in the market and the prices will go down. So the ball is in the American court and the European court and not with India. And India should not be forced to change its stand just because of America's whims and fancies. Then Ms. Curtis is also making a point that if America would not have imposed sanctions on Russia, then what signal would it have sent to China? China would have been more emboldened. It would have decided to invade Taiwan or even wage a war against India as well. Thus, America's stand of putting sanctions on Russia is actually to show the world that we respect democracy. And we'll do the same if China does something against Taiwan or India. So India should support this stand because it is seen as a leader of democratic nations across the world. However, for Mr. Akbaruddin, there is nothing wrong with India's stand. And at the end of the day, entire foreign policy is based on the simple phrase of national interest. As long as the decisions taken by country are in their own national interest, there should not be any doubt over that, and the country that is sovereign can take its decision on its own. As we saw in the article, and you would have read this in the news also, the Indian government has been constantly saying that we are not even giving a second thought. We will certainly go ahead and buy discounted oil from Russia. Now, as per the news report that I saw in the newspapers, what Russia is saying is, if you look at the prices of pre-war level, so the day that the war started, on that day, whatever the international prices are, Russia is offering a discount of almost $35 per barrel to India. Now, this is a huge discount for India at a time when inflation is increasing, at a time that the cost of living in India is increasing considerably. And if India can import oil at such a price and pass on this to the consumer, this will be great help for the Indian middle class and the Indian lower class. And that is why what is happening in the White House or the decisions taken by the American president or the American representatives should not impact India's thinking of helping our own lower middle class. The next article takes us away from international relations for a bit and focuses on the government's decision to impose new taxes on employees' provident fund income. Now, in very simple terms, if you're working in the formal sector and you are earning over 15,000 rupees a month, then the law is that you should pay some of your salary to an account called the EPF, that is the Employee Provident Fund account, where the money will be saved for your retirement. Now, usually whatever money goes to the Provident Fund account, when you take it out at the time of retirement, there is no taxes imposed on that. This is what the government is changing now. In last year's budget, the government had announced a new provision that there will be income tax put on the Provident Fund contribution, but not of everyone. Only on those employees who are contributing over 2.5 lakh rupees per year in their EPF account. Now, as I said, the Employee Provident Fund account is mandatory for people working in the formal sector and earning 15,000 rupees or more in a firm that has at least 20 employees. So if your company has less than 20 employees, then it is not mandatory on them to open up the EPF account. Now, whatever salary that you get, usually 12% of the basic pay and the DNS allowance is deducted and is submitted in the EPF. The same amount is given by your company on your behalf. If you want, you can put more money in this also, because you want that at the time of my retirement, I should have more money with me. That is entirely up to you. But the least contribution is 12% of your basic and DA. The government is saying that the taxes will only be imposed on those people who are contributing over 2.5 lakh rupees in a year. That means it is not covering most of India. It is only covering those people who are earning very high and who are putting much more money in their PF account. The government says that 93% people who put money in the EPF account are putting less than 2.5 lakh. So it will only impact high net worth individuals and not common people. Also, for government employees especially, this limit is increased to 5 lakh rupees per year. So as far as the government employees are concerned, they will only be taxed if they contribute over 5 lakh rupees per year in the EPF account. Now, how much will be the tax? The tax will be 20% of the income. Remember, 20% of the income, that is the interest that you are earning on this money. 20% of that will be deducted if your PAN account number is not linked to your EPF number. On the other hand, if your EPF account has been linked with your PAN account, then you would only have to pay 10% on the money that you're earning as interest if your contribution is over 2.5 lakh rupees in the EPF account per year from the private sector. The third category is of non-resident employees. So if you are not living in India but you are still depositing money in the EPF, then 30% taxes will be imposed, unless if you're living in a country that has a specific DTAA, that is Double Taxation Avoidance Agreement with India. In that case, the tax rate will be lower as per the agreement. Now, most people have not really appreciated this policy because this was seen as one of the only ways in which you can accumulate money for your retirement without paying taxes to the government. So why is it that the government is putting such taxation? The government is saying that many people are taking undue advantage of this. This kind of a scheme is mainly so that you have a social security net available to you when you retire. But many people, since they have a lot of money, are contributing huge amounts of money in these funds to get a good rate of interest without any taxes. And that is what the government does not want to happen. And that is why a tax is being imposed specifically on those who are putting higher money into this. Earlier, the government had in fact capped the contribution, as in how much contribution can you make in this scheme. That was about 7.5 lakh rupees per year. But now the government has decided you can deposit whatever money that you want in the EPF with just a minimum limit that is given to you, and there would be tax imposed on above 2.5 lakh per year contribution from the private sector. That is why, to curb this wrong practice and to ensure that only genuine people invest genuine amounts in the EPF for their retirement benefit, the government has taken such a step. Now, the entire system of Employee Provident Fund is handled by an organization called the Employees Provident Fund Organization that came into being through the Employees Provident Fund and Miscellaneous Provisions Act of 1952. This organization is administered by the Ministry of Labour and Employment. They are the ones who run the employee pension scheme called the EPS in 1995. It makes a provision for pension of employees in the organized sector after the age of 58 years. As we discussed, both the employee and the employer contribute 12% of the employee's monthly salary, that is basic pay, plus the DNS allowance to this scheme. It is mandatory for employees who draw a basic wage of 15,000 rupees or higher. For the central government employees, the central government also contributes 1.16% of the employee's monthly salary into this EPF. The next article is from the archives of the Hindu newspaper, meaning that the same article with some outdated data was published earlier as well in October 2020. It has been published again because the issue is still prevalent and this has been brought to our attention once again. This is mainly on the issue of manual scavenging in India and the problems that sanitation workers still face in India despite multiple laws being passed for their welfare. As per the Social Justice and Empowerment Ministry, about 971 people have lost their life in India just by clearing sewers and septic tanks since 1993. The year 1993 is important because that is the year that a law was introduced prohibiting the employment of manual scavengers. So even after that, if the official government data is saying that over 970 people have lost their life, means something is wrong in the country and this law has not been followed properly. Manual scavenging still remains a big problem in India and it is still caste ridden. Means most of the sanitation workers, unfortunately, that you see in India are from the Dalit community. And thus there is a very strong connection between caste and this kind of work in the Indian society. The movement against manual scavenging started in 1990s. The movement was to abolish dry latrines. Now while that has mostly been achieved, but there are new problems that have emerged now. For example, now the problems are of manhole deaths. Now on the roads you would see there are a lot of manholes which have to be cleaned by a person going inside. Now these are sanitation workers who go into these manholes to clean them up. Now when they go inside these manholes, understand the fact that they are filled with toxic gases, the worst kind of waste, and they are not given any security gear, any medical facilities, and they are playing with their life every single time that they are entering these manholes. And that is why you see that there have been multiple deaths of people who have gone into these manholes to clean them up. There is no provision for safety equipment, etc., which is a demand that people are still making. There are some state governments who have now introduced the concept of motorized cleaning or robotic cleaning without the need of a human being going inside the manhole, but still this is a reality. The civil societies have also demanding abolishing the dehumanizing practice of manual removal of human excreta and introduction of machines for handling waste. Now, despite the fact that we are living in a society where we have machines to do every single task, but the task of human excreta removal is still being done manually in many parts of India, especially the rural India, by sanitation workers without any equipment that is given to them. Now, for some people, even thinking about this can give you a bad feeling. But then think about the people whose job it is to do it every single day because they have to earn money. In 1993, the government did pass the act which prohibited the construction of dry latrines, means toilets without any water supply. Because in these toilets, obviously, someone has to manually remove the human waste. So that was prohibited since 1993. Also, the government banned employing manual scavengers. Manual scavengers again are people who are employed to pick up and to deposit human waste by using their bare hands. Now the problem with the law is that the law focused mainly only on the dry latrines part. But the manual scavenging practice is not just related to dry latrines but also related to insanitary latrines and open defecation. If someone is not even going to latrines, if they're just using open grounds for human excretion, even then someone would have to come and pick it up. This is someone's job, and that is why people are falling ill. That is why people are dying because of this particular practice that has been in existence, even though the laws have been passed. In fact, till 1993, some state governments had an official post called the scavengers, whose job it was to manually remove human excreta in the households that did not have working toilets. Thankfully, at least those official jobs have now been removed. The reason for that is there was a lot of pressure from the Safai Karmchari Andolan, and the Supreme Court also intervened and asked the central government to undertake a survey of manual scavengers in 2013. The survey found out that despite the 1993 Act, we still have dry latrines existing in India, and we still have the practice of manual scavengers being employed in almost all parts of the country. Now, although the construction of dry latrines has reduced after 1993, but the problem has now shifted, as I said earlier, to manholes, sewers, septic tanks, where people again have to go underground and clean them up in the middle of all the toxic gases without any help given to them. The problem is seen in almost all states of India. The article gives an example of Tamil Nadu. In Tamil Nadu, all political parties have trade unions for government servants except that of sanitation workers. Now, because most of the sanitation workers are Dalits, it was expected that maybe the Dalits movements would focus on that. But that is also not true. Dalit movements also have faced to focus on this problem, and most of the sanitation workers don't have a permanent job status. They are called whenever they are required, they are given a day's wages, and then they are let go without any permanent job benefit. They don't even have their job ID cards. They don't even have any medical protection. Considering the work that they do, they are bound to fall ill very, very frequently. In fact, in the Indian society, such work is seen to be so low that it is very difficult to find volunteers to take up such work. For example, whenever there is a natural calamity, you can still find volunteers to distribute food, to distribute other material, but it is very hard to find people to do the cleanup work or disposal of dead bodies, because it is seen as a work that many people can't even see or can't even handle. And then imagine the people whose job it is to do this every single day. Most of these workers are not even given any vehicles. They either have to walk long distances or they have their own garbage vehicles using which they would go from one place to the other. Thus, nowhere in the Indian society have we given the kind of dignity that these workers deserve. Now, apart from the 1993 Act that I mentioned multiple times, there are some other steps that have also been taken by the government. The last of it was in the year 2020 when the earlier Act was amended. The amendment was that there should be completely mechanization of sewer cleaning, and there should be ways for on-site protection and compensation for manual scavengers in case of sewer deaths. This was an amendment in the 2013 law. That was a law which went one step ahead from 1993 law. Apart from prohibiting dry latrines, it also prohibited insanitary latrines and open drains, pits, etc. Apart from that, we also had the Prevention of Atrocities Act of 1989, which came because of the fact that over 90% people employed as manual scavengers belong to the scheduled caste, and that is why there was a law specially introduced for preventing the atrocities on the scheduled caste in India. The government of India has also started celebrating the Safai Mitra Suraksha Challenge launched by the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs on the World Toilet Day. The government launched this challenge for all the states to make their sewer cleaning activity mechanized by April 2021. The Supreme Court also had given a judgment in 2014 saying that the government must identify all the people who have died due to sewage work since 1993, that is, after the original law was passed, and give a compensation of rupees 10 lakh each to their family members. The one organization that the government had formed earlier to look into their welfare was a National Commission for Safai Karamcharis. It was made first as a statutory body in 1994 only for a 3-year period. So this came up right after the 1993 Act to ensure that the implementation of the Act is done properly. Government thought that for 3 years it would look into the implementation of the Act and then we can dissolve that because the Act will work on its own. However, after the 3 years were over, it was extended up to 2002 and then it was extended up to 2004. So till 2004, it remained a statutory body. After 2004 also, the body has continued to exist. However, now it is a non-statutory body, means now it is an executive body. It still investigates the conditions of Safai Karamcharis in India and makes recommendations to the Government of India. The current extension was due to expire on the 31st of March 2022, but it has still been extended. So this body exists even today, just that now it is in the form of an executive body. These are the articles we wanted to discuss on the Hindu newspaper today. Now a couple of practice questions. Number 1. Even multiple laws haven't been able to get rid of the stigma attached to the lives of sanitation workers. Elaborate on some of the issues faced by sanitation workers in India. Second, by asserting its right to neutrality in the Ukraine crisis, India has in fact chosen a side. Do you agree? Discuss. Both these questions have to be answered within 250 words each. Thank you so much for watching the video.